Hey everyone, welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. I'm Adam, and our goal for today is to discuss nativism, empiricism, and the origins of knowledge. The article that we read for today was an article by Spelke. The title is Nativism, Empiricism, and the Origins of Knowledge, published in the journal Infant Behavior and Development. Here are some of the important questions from the article today. What aspects of knowledge emerge in children prior to their first contacts with the objects of their knowledge? And what aspects emerge through the shaping effects of experience with those objects? Another question, what aspects of knowledge are constant over human development from the moment that infants begin to make sense of the world? And what aspects change as children grow and learn? We covered the concepts of nativism and empiricism in the last lecture. We should see that these questions pertain to those two viewpoints. Nativism having to do with knowledge being more innate to us as humans versus empiricism, the view that knowledge is acquired from experience. Scholars are often labeled nativists or empiricists according to the kinds of answers that they provide to the two sample questions that we just considered. Again, to be super clear, empiricism is the view that knowledge is due to experience-based learning from the environment. A great view of that was the tabula rasa, mind as a blank slate view, right? Where when we're born, our mind is a blank slate. It doesn't come with any content, and any content that the mind has must be impressed upon the mind from experience, right? Sort of like a blank canvas, and it's life and experience that paints a picture onto that canvas. The opposite view on the other side of the extreme is the nativist view, right? And nativism is the view that knowledge is due to intrinsic properties of human perceptual and cognitive systems. Okay, and we discussed some arguments for that view in the last lecture. We saw that language is highly complicated and it seems almost impossible to learn the complexities of natural language unless we had something like a universal grammar, an innate module for learning language, or at least that was the argument provided by Chomsky. Okay, so throughout the history of philosophy and scholarly thought on these issues, we usually have these as two diametrically opposed views, right? You're either an empiricist or you're a nativist. You think the mind is a blank slate, or you think that the mind comes with modules, right? Language, other forms of knowledge are innate if we bring that knowledge to bear to the world rather than acquiring that knowledge from the world, right? And we saw that the view of language, universal grammar, is that it's more like a heart, right? In that it's something that we're endowed with, and it's something that matures through our development, right? So we don't need to learn how to grow a heart. We just have one. And as we develop, the heart develops as well. The similar idea is that language or our other cognitive modules, cognitive mechanisms are of that kind, okay? What we see here, one of the important reasons why I had you read this article by Liz Spelke, there's a lot of great work in developmental psychology. So why do we pick this article? One, Spelke is a leader in the field. She's done some very groundbreaking work. And so I thought it was appropriate to cover some of her research. Two, there's an important point here that we don't necessarily need to think of nativism and empiricism as diametrically opposed views that are categorically opposed to each other, right? But rather, we can start to think about knowledge along a continuum, right? So instead of asking, is this knowledge native, right? Is it nativist or innate? Or is this knowledge derived from experience? We can start asking more nuanced questions, right? To what extent, right, along this continuum is knowledge more innate or more dependent upon experience and future development? Okay, this is very important because it can help us be more productive and get out of these dichotomous, mutually exclusive positions. Also, it's going to help us start painting a developmental picture for when knowledge starts to develop with respect to each other, right? Which is also very important, right? I think that the answer philosophically for a lot of knowledge is that it's somewhere in between these two extremes, but also more importantly, or as important, is we want to start to put knowledge within a developmental timetable, right? And we'll see from today that some knowledge of objects occurs earlier, and then some knowledge occurs a little bit later, okay? And I think it's helpful for us to have this approach or appreciation in mind, okay? That's one of the fruitful things about this article by Spelke. Also, this article is nice because Spelke is going to consider and offer some responses to common objections to nativism. All right. If you're one of my previous students that took embodied approaches to mind and language with me, you should know that I myself have a lot of challenges to nativism, right? But you notice from the beginning of this course, we took a friendly, considerate approach of the nativist viewpoint because there's something to be said about how we learn language, right? We don't want to reject nativism completely. We want to appreciate the arguments. We want to, especially today, investigate some of core knowledge, which seems to be a part of our knowledge either innately or at a very early age, right? But we just don't want to be, we don't need to be committed to the view that all knowledge is of that form, okay? So one of the things I want you to do as you read through the article is pick up some of the facts, like what has been shown in recent developmental research, but also consider some of the potential objections, right, to core knowledge and how Spelke responds to some of those objections. Okay, I think it's really cool and helpful to read through those objections and counter objections. For those of you that are philosophers, especially in the course, this is important for the nature of your thorough argumentation for a position, okay? If you're a nativist or if you're an empiricist, to me, it doesn't really matter, right? I care about you just as much, regardless of your philosophical position. What's important to me is how you present your position, right? And a healthy form of argument is going to be presenting both views, like the nativist view and the empiricist view, considering strengths and weaknesses of each view, right? And so what you might do in your paper or in your presentation is present the case for nativism. Maybe you'll discuss some aspects of core knowledge that you find very convincing that humans demonstrate at an early age. Then you can consider some objections to your view, right? You don't want to just push your view. Think about what a reasonable challenger might raise in response to your view, right? Consider it carefully, do a good job of giving that view careful consideration, right? And then provide your response to that view, right? And then by the time that you conclude your article or your presentation, your reader or your audience will know that you've carefully thought about both sides of the debate and that your conclusion is a well-considered, well-weighted one, okay? So that's why I think it's helpful to read this article and consider some of the objections and responses in this debate, okay? All right, great. It's really hot today. I don't know about you guys, but it's burning up in here. Okay, so how do we know, as scientists, as developmental psychologists, how do we study knowledge in young children? Like, how do we know what they know, right? Well, even though this seems a little bit challenging, right? Because children can't give us verbal reports. We can't give them a questionnaire and ask them what they think. Also, when we study knowledge in non-human animals, they can't give us verbal reports either, right? So we need to think of some other ways in which we can interrogate, design experiments to investigate the epistemic status of young children as well as non-human animals, okay? Luckily, we've developed a lot of amazing, innovative techniques for studying the mental states of children and non-human animals, right? When I was at UCSD, I worked in the language acquisition and sound recognition lab, and we used eye tracking methodologies to study kids, okay? In this work, we'll see that they've also relied upon looking preferences as well as sucking preferences, right? Because as children, we have both looking preferences and sucking preferences, and we can draw upon looking preferences and sucking preferences to figure out what children know and what they don't know. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we know that infants show systematic looking preferences towards novel items or novel displays as opposed to familiar ones. Okay. Also, we know that infants display increased sucking behavior when presented with novel displays or new information as opposed to familiar displays or already known information, right? And so what we can do now is by either tracking looking preference or sucking rate, right? We can provide an infant with a stimuli, and then we can change the stimuli. Maybe there's a minor change, right? And if that change is imperceptible to the infant, then that sucking rate should continue to decline over time. Or it should, the looking preferences, they should start to get bored of looking at that item, right? And that's how we would know that like two stimuli, there's an undetectable change from one to the next, right? Because the infants, they continue to fatigue or get bored. And that means the stimuli is the same experientially for that infant, okay? On the other hand, say we have one stimuli, we make a minor change to the second stimuli. If the infant can perceive that the second stimuli is different than the first, then they should display an increased sucking rate as well as preferential looking at that object. Okay, and that's how we can systematically design experiments to test whether information is something that they've already become accustomed to, right? Based on something that they already know, because then they're going to display sort of like a habituation, okay, or a decreased looking and sucking rate. Okay. On the other hand, if information is new, they're going to start to increase their sucking rate again, as well as demonstrate increased looking preference. Okay, there's some other awesome techniques, but for the purposes of today, the research we'll cover today, I think this is sufficient for today. Okay. So by examining the looking preference and sucking rate of young children under different experimental conditions, scholars can gain some insight into the knowledge that children already have, as well as the knowledge that they acquire and learn through experience. So let's look at some interesting findings that were discussed in the article by Spelke. And the reason we're looking at these studies is we're trying to get clear on the nature of knowledge in young kids, what they know at an early age, and when they start to know it. Okay. So one study, a research by Slater and colleagues in 1990, found that newborn infants, right, newborns cannot yet perceive the unity of a moving center occluded object. Okay, by center occluded object, like imagine that, like right now I'm center occluded, right? There's like this paper towel thing that's preventing you can't see the center of me, right? That means the center is occluded, but you can see like the left and right side of me. I think you can, right? Yes. Okay. So that's what's meant by center occlusion, an object that is center occluded. Okay. Newborn infants cannot perceive the unity of that, right? Of me as a constant single unit, right? If this is moving. Okay, but 4-month-old infants can perceive the unity of a moving center occluded object. Okay, so if at newborn, at 1 month, right, if I'm moving and this is moving, say I'm moving up and this is moving down, the infant's not going to be able to perceive they don't yet understand that the left and right side of me are bound together, right? They're just going to sort of see these as distinct things, right? So like this side of me is one thing, this side of me is another thing, and this is another thing, okay? However, interestingly enough, 4-month-old infants can perceive the unity of a moving center occluded object, okay? So this is important, right? Because it's showing two things. One is that we have knowledge, like an intuitive physics, right? Like we have knowledge of objects at a very early age, incredibly early age. At 4 months old, we already have some concept, right, of object, of entityness or object constancy, right? That's pretty awesome that we have knowledge like an intuitive physics at such a young age, okay? Also, another important point from this study is that notice that although we have this knowledge of objects at a young age, the age at which we have this knowledge of intuitive physics is not 0 years old, right? It's not completely innate, it's not completely native, or else we might expect similar performance at both 4 months and at newborn, okay? And we'll see later in the lecture that chicks, right, little chicks, they actually they demonstrate this, okay? So we'll see that for humans, that we're going to be somewhere on this continuum, right, for intuitive physics, right? Maybe not in the middle, but maybe closer towards the nativist side, but not at the extreme, right? Where we're like, development and experience has nothing to do with intuitive physics, okay? Because this study shows that that's not quite true, okay? At least for the human case, okay? All right, so that's the important thing about the Slater study, is that it shows sort of that at 4 months, we perceive this, but as newborns, we do not. More recent work in 1995 by Johnson and Nanez found that this transition period, right, from not being able to perceive the unity of a moving center occluded object to being able to perceive the unity of a moving center occluded object, we see that that transition occurs at around 2 months of age, okay? So the first study by Slater showed that at newborns do not have this ability, but 4 months old do. Subsequent work tried to figure out exactly where between newborn and 4 months this transition occurs, right? Sort of like acquiring object permanence, right, or constancy, and we see that it's at about 2 months, okay? So that's cool that we know around 2 months we seem to demonstrate this transition to objectness, permanence, and intuitive physics, okay? This suggests that this form of object knowledge develops very early in human life, but is not present precisely at birth. Okay, so rather than characterizing object knowledge or even any kind of knowledge as purely innate or as purely empirical, we can ask, at what point in development does this occur? And what is responsible for its healthy, uninterrupted development? Okay, cool. Let's look at some other interesting findings that were discussed in Spelke. Some other sort of timeline events. We know that by 4 months of age, infants perceive figure-ground relationships. Okay, so they can perceive figure-ground relationships by analyzing the relative motions and depth relations among visible surfaces. By 4 months, infants also perceive a center occluded object as continuous when its visible surfaces undergo common motion. And by 9 months old, infants begin to obtain occluded objects by reaching around or displacing the occluders. Okay. Other interesting findings that were discussed in Spelke. Young infants are only sensitive to some of the constraints on objects that adults can recognize. Okay, so again, showing that there's a developmental improvement in object representations for children, okay? Also, young infants do not represent object properties as robustly as adults do. Children demonstrate knowledge of basic properties of objects before they demonstrate the ability to reach for objects or crawl around them, okay? There was some work in psychology that suggests that we learn about objects by manipulating objects, right? There's a lot of important work on this. So one question is, does manual interaction, is that necessary first in order to gain object knowledge, right? And we know through the work of Piaget that the interacting with objects is important for cognitive development. The question here is, do you need to manipulate objects first in order to understand sort of like that an entity is bound, right, for example? And so what's important here is that we find that what's really interesting is that even before we're able to manipulate objects physically, like before I'm able to reach for an object, hold the object, move an occluder to play with an object, before I can do any of those more complex things, I have an understanding of objects first, right? At a slightly younger age, based on perception, right? I know that, right, based on figure ground and depth relations, I know that this is an object, even if there's an occluder in the way of it, okay? And I know that even before my first manipulation with the object, okay? So here we're seeing that as we get older, we become sensitive to more constraints on objects. We also develop more robust representations of objects, okay? And also we have a knowledge of objects visually, right, or perceptually first, even before we can act or perform motor actions to manipulate those objects, okay? This is just to help enrich our understanding of sort of like the development of children and their cognitive abilities. The important point here is that children demonstrate knowledge of objects very early in life, but also demonstrate improvements in their knowledge of objects through development and experience. So Spelke argues that strong explanatory theories of cognitive development have at least these three qualities, okay? So you're asking, what makes a strong theory, right, of the mind or of the development of knowledge? Spelke has an answer for you. Your explanation or your explanatory account must be complete, it must be consistent, and it must be empirically adequate. Okay, so you might have like a complete account. Maybe you're Hegel or you're a philosopher, right? Like Kant, and you know, boom, systems are your thing. And so you wrote, you know, like a huge book on a systematic book, and that might be complete and consistent, right? It might talk about all sorts of knowledge, and it might be internally related with each other where like the concepts make sense with the other concepts, right? So it's complete and consistent, but it may be completely inadequate empirically, right? It may have nothing to do with how children actually develop knowledge, right? On the other hand, we can have an account that's empirically adequate. Like I can collect different facts about development and neuroscience, but it may be inconsistent explanatorily or incomplete. Okay, maybe I'm only focusing on, like we discussed the different levels of analysis from Marr, maybe I'm only considering certain aspects or levels of analysis, and my analysis is not yet complete or comprehensive. Okay, so just sort of a checks and balances on your theoretical account of development. You need to make sure that you're complete, consistent, and empirically adequate. So rather than rushing to defend a particular theoretical viewpoint, right, rather than just sort of already assuming one viewpoint, like I'm an empiricist or I'm a nativist, let's go find data that supports my view, right? Rather than committing first and then finding data that supports that a priori commitment, let's continue to read widely first as cognitive scientists, right? We have so much excellent material from different subdisciplines that are relevant to our investigations. So let's read widely from the subdisciplines of cognitive science and also systematically investigate these issues in order to arrive at a complete, consistent, and empirically adequate account of human knowledge. Okay, that's what I suggest we do as an approach. We can continue to study newborns, infants, and human children with eye tracking and other innovative techniques. We can also study non-human animals such as chicks, rats, fish, and other animals, which allows us to carry out invasive procedures and other techniques that we can't carry out on human children, right? Due to serious ethical issues. We'll see that in some of the studies on chicks, right? From the time that they're born, we like raise them in a certain isolated environment, right? We definitely can't do that with human children, right? So the benefit of working with non-human animals is that ethically we're allowed to, or at least the IRB will approve our systematic study of animals to the extent that is not available on humans, okay? All right, that covered the major points from the article by Spelke, Nativism, Empiricism, and the Origins of Knowledge. This next article that I want to discuss is entitled Core Knowledge of Object Number and Geometry. This is actually very much related to, and it covers some of the same material as the article by Spelke, okay? But there's some great figures in this article and also some additional data that I want to use this article to discuss with you, okay? It's sort of a long article and I didn't want to have you read, you know, like 40, 60 pages worth of material for today. Okay, so Spelke was required. This, I'm just going to enjoy sharing some of the findings and thoughts with you, okay? Maybe some of you want to present or write your paper on these topics, okay? Again, we're talking about core knowledge here, right? We are studying cognitive science or cognitive aspects of the mind, and core knowledge is concerned with the knowledge that we have very early. Okay, you can think of universal grammar might be a kind of core knowledge that we have, right? You might also think that intuitive physics or our conception of objects is also part of our core knowledge, right? We're just trying to think about the inventory of prepackaged knowledge that we have as children, either purely prepackaged or somewhat prepackaged. Maybe, you know, a little nudging from experience can help. Okay, but that's what we mean by core knowledge. And what we're trying to do here is understand how much core knowledge do we have, right? Are we limited to only intuitive physics? Are we limited to only universal grammar? Or do we have core knowledge of many more things, right? It's an interesting question, and we'll look through the article and see what kind of core knowledge we may have, or at least what kind of core knowledge animals have, okay? Some of these studies will be done on chicks and other non-human animals. In this article, we'll consider several forms of core knowledge in humans and non-human animals. In particular, we'll look at intuitive physics, biological motion, geometry, and faces. All right, so first, let's look at intuitive physics. We already talked a little bit about this, but let's continue the conversation. So Ciandetti and Vallortigara in 2011 investigated naive physics conceptions in newborn chicks. And naive physics is, you know, the early conception that we have of objects, right, being bounded entities, okay, that endure through time, okay? So one way that we can study chicks, well, first there's a little bit of background I gotta inform you about chicks, right? They have this process of imprinting, which is a learning process by which the young of chicks or other animals, they learn the characteristics of an object by simply being exposed to it soon after hatching, okay? So you might think that this ability is somewhat innate or part of the prepackaging of a chick, right? Is that they have this capacity for imprinting, okay? As in other forms of learning, there are biological predispositions that act to guide and facilitate imprinting in young chicks. Okay, so we're gonna, since we know that chicks imprint, we're gonna look at a study that uses this knowledge of chicks to figure out what they know about objects. Okay, so in this study by Ciandetti and Vallortigara, separate groups of chicks were imprinted on objects of different sizes. Okay, so you can think of like one group of chicks, right? I forget exactly how many chicks they have, but let's just say like there's 20 chicks, and the first, say there's 40 chicks, and the first 20 chicks are going to imprint on this object, okay? And then the other 20 chicks are going to imprint on this object, okay? So newborn chicks, we'll put them in here, have them imprint, right? This chick is only imprinting on this object, and that chick is only imprinting on this object. Okay, so we're sort of like raising them in different early environments. At test, chicks were placed, right? Each individual chick was placed one at a time in this environment. They were placed in a transparent holding box and were able to see the imprinting object moving along a straight midline towards two identical screens. Okay, so if you see here, first the chicks imprinted on the object, and then the chick was placed in this room, but had sort of like an enclosure, a see-through enclosure placed around them. So that way they can see the object, they can still see this red object, but they can't move yet, right? They can't like move forward, left, right. They just have to sort of hang out there and watch this object. As the red object moves away from them, then it's going to be occluded, right? There's going to be sort of a barrier put down so that the chick can't see its object anymore, okay? When the, as their view is occluded, right? The imprinted object, so this red cylinder is removed, okay? These two screens that the object was initially drifting towards, they were initially of the same size, but after the occluder is put down, they're replaced, right? So from the chick's point of view, it's just seeing its object, red object, move towards two screens of the same size, and then a wall comes down and there's changes being made that they can't see. Okay, so they're just seeing the wall, and then when the wall goes back up, right, the two screens that were of the same side, they're now a little bit different, right? In some conditions, like it's like this, right? And another one's in one condition they change the height, another one it's the width, another one it's the slant. Okay, but the idea is the same, is that the chick sees its imprinted object move towards two things that are the same. The occluder comes down so they can't see anymore. Then the occluder is removed, and now what they see is something a little bit new, right? So for example, we see on this image down here, whereas the two screens were the same size before, now one is short and the other one is tall, okay? And also the red object is not there anymore, right? And so if you're the chick, your question is, where did it go, right? Where did the red object go? If you saw that red object drift away from you, say it was like $1 million that you wanted, and then all of a sudden like your vision was occluded, and then when you could see again, the $1 million was gone, you'd be like, hey, where'd my $1 million go? And you would go look for the $1 million, or you would go search for it, right? The idea here is, since this is low and this is high, the chick should know that this object that it imprinted on is not behind this one, but perhaps behind this one, right? So that's the idea behind this experiment, is that even though the object is gone, the chick should draw an inference if it has some concept of objects, right? Like of object permanence, that, you know, like objects don't pop in and out of existence randomly, then the chick will draw an inference that this occluded object is probably behind there, right? If, on the other hand, the chick just didn't have a concept of objects, and objects were just sort of like popping in and out of existence, then when the occluder comes down and goes back up, the chick shouldn't really care or be motivated to search for the occluded, for this imprinted object, right? Like, oh, life is just like this, right? Things pop in and pop out of existence. But that's not the case. Chicks, in fact, go and look behind this object, right? And what's really cool about this is it shows that they do have a concept of object, right? They do have a concept of this thing because it was moving away from them, and then they no longer saw it. They had an idea that the object must still be there somewhere, right? It's still there somewhere. I got to go find it. And another thing that they infer is that it must be behind this tall wall and not behind this low wall, right? It might be that objects also constantly change size. So maybe as this object went back, right, it shrunk and is now behind this one, right? Theoretically, right, if the universe was bizarre, then it could be like that, right? In a possible world, it may be that items shrink as time goes on, right? At least philosophically, that's a possibility. But we see that chicks don't act as if their experience of the world is like that. That's the important thing, okay? They act like they have a concept of object, okay? I think this is a really interesting experiment. And you see that we have to be really ingenious in thinking about how we can create an experiment to test the knowledge of non-human animals, okay? All right, so just to restate, results found that chicks chose to search only behind the screen that could hide the object, okay? This suggests that chicks show sophisticated abilities concerning physical objects and the properties of occlusion in the absence of specific experience, right? Excuse me. This, again, this is a very interesting finding because this was the first time chicks had this experience with occluders and whatnot, right? There were newborns, after they were born, they were imprinted on these objects, and then they were set off to do this. So they didn't have previous experience with this task. So we know they're not drawing upon prior experience to solve this task right now. Okay, so core knowledge in chicks of intuitive physics. All right, now that we have an idea of intuitive physics, we have an idea that chicks have an idea of objects, as well as very young humans have an intuitive idea of objects. Let's look at another one, a core knowledge of faces. So research by Rosa Salva, Regalin, and Vallortigara found that completely naive, newly hatched chicks prefer face-like stimuli to features on top stimuli. Okay, so face-like stimuli is on the left. So I call this features on bottom, right? And then the features on top stimuli, the non-facial stimuli, is the image on the right, okay? So like no one's face looks like this. This is weird, right? Like that would be like two eyes and then a mouth up here. That doesn't look like a face. This looks like a face, right? Two eyes and then possibly like a nose and a mouth there, okay? So the idea is when presented with these two stimuli, is there a preference, a systematic preference for one versus the other? Right? If there isn't, maybe there's a 50-50 split, like some chicks go towards this figure, some other chicks go to this figure, right? If it was 50-50, then that would probably be a case that there isn't an innate or there isn't core knowledge for faces, okay? But we see that newborns, right, with no training, no history of training, newborns, freshly hatched chicks prefer this to this. Right. So that gives strong evidence that there's something about this stimuli, right, that's perhaps ecologically and evolutionarily important for animals or that type of animal. Okay. Notice that in this case, the preference is not the result of exposure learning. since chicks exhibit this preference to approach face-like stimuli even without any previous experience. Okay. So you see why it's so cool to do experiments on animals, because we can do studies on like newborns, whereas we can't do that on humans. Okay, and we can consider this as part of the core knowledge that chicks come pre-equipped with. All right, in another study, well, by the same group, right? They're really interested in faces. So in another study, they also found that both newly hatched chicks as well as human newborns demonstrate similar preferences for face stimuli over spatial frequency matched structured noise. Okay, so what's cool about this additional study that this group did is that it's showing core knowledge in humans, right? In human newborns, right, for faces. So that's really cool. It's saying that there's something about us as human beings that even as newborns, we have a preference for faces, okay? And we see here that this is the face that infants will demonstrate preferential looking towards rather than this. And also chicks will walk towards this as opposed towards this. Even though this is structured, right? It looks weird to us because we know what faces look like, but you know, like there's still structure here, right? That's a thing, this is a thing, that's a thing. So in terms of like spatial frequency matched structure, this has similar properties as this. But even though they have similar properties, there's a strong early preference for this over this, okay? And it's just, again, further pointing out that there's something about faces in humans and non-human animals that are very important to us, okay? And we're noticing here that the timeline for this is very early. So that's also noteworthy. Cool. So now we've seen core knowledge for intuitive physics or objects, object representations, as well as for faces. Another interesting study demonstrates core knowledge for biological motion. Okay. Research by a similar group, Vallortigara, as you can see, has published many studies on core knowledge. Vallortigara, Regalin, and Marcanato found that naive, newly hatched chicks lacking any previous visual experience showed a spontaneous preference to biological, to approach stimuli that demonstrated biological motion as opposed to other forms of stimuli. Okay, so this was a really cool study, and what they did is they used like a 13-point light display, as you can see right here, and it was either the lights were either patterned in such a way that it looked like an animal moving, or they displayed other patterns. Okay, one was a pattern that depicted a walking hen. So sort of like this kind of looks like a hen, right? It's static here, but imagine that this is in motion. The other light display depicted rigid motion. Okay, so not walking like with biological motion, but more like rigid motion, okay? And then the next two were lights depicting random motion, and then just a scrambled hen, okay? And what we found from the study, or what the scholars found in the study, is that newborn chicks, right, with no prior experience, they have a preference for the light display that depicts biological motions. The one that looks like, the light display that depicts the most natural biological motion is the one that the hen displays a spontaneous preference for, okay? And that's really amazing, right? If you think about it, how does a newborn that just popped out, right? Like, boom, here I am, hello world, and then like, I already like this thing that moves like a biological entity does, right? It's pretty amazing, okay? When we cover evolutionary psychology, we'll start to think about cognition in an evolutionary context and think about why our minds might have adapted in such a way. Okay, but the purpose of today is just to point out that these are empirically verifiable phenomena. okay? So that later we can interrogate why we might have this phenomena, why it's the case that this phenomena exists, okay? All right, next, we'll look at evidence for core knowledge of geometry. So human children and non-human animals show a very sophisticated knowledge of spatial layout with some rudimentary understanding of geometric properties. Consider the following experiment with me, okay? And we can look at this image to help us get in the proper mindset for this experiment, okay? Imagine you're this chick, right? You're located in this empty room. It's a rectangular room, notice the shape, with identically colored walls and no external cues. So you see the walls are all the same color, like gray. The whole room is gray, and there's no cues to help you identify like the front of the room or the left of the room, right? You're just sort of in a plain room that's in the shape of a rectangle. In a corner, in one of the corners, there's a visible goal, right? Perhaps it's a food reward. Perhaps it's an exit, right? Some sort of goal, visible goal for you. Then you're displaced from the room, right? So say you started off in that room, but now I'm going to take you out of the room real quick. Close your eyes, spin you around, right? So that way you're not as oriented as you were previously within the room. Okay. After I take you out of the room, spin you around, make you dizzy, put you back in the room. Okay. The goal object is no longer visible now. Okay. So say the food reward is not visible, the exit's no longer visible. Your task is to figure out the corner where the goal object was previously located. Okay. So how could you figure out where the object was previously located in this room? That's the task. Okay, this is hard because all corners look identical, right? If you look in this corner, it's like gray and gray. Look at this corner, gray and gray. This corner, gray and gray, right? It's just all gray all around. So how can you remember, or how can you figure out which of the four corners your food reward was in before I took you out and spun you around? Okay. You might search randomly in the room, for example. That might be one strategy that you have. Well, I can't remember and there's no identifying markers. So let me just, 25% chance go to this corner, 25% chance go to that corner, right? And I might give each corner like a 25% chance of being the correct corner where my food reward was previously located, okay? However, if you think for a moment, if you're this chick, maybe you don't want to expend too much energy, or maybe you want to have a more thoughtful strategy, right? You'll realize that there's a partial solution that's on the table for you, although it's not a complete solution, okay? Really, the corner which had your food reward previously isn't sort of like a 25% chance to be in any corner, right? Because recall that this room is in the shape of a rectangle, right? So say that originally the food reward was in this corner right here, where this blue square is. Notice that if you saw your food reward in that corner, you also see that to the left is a long wall, and then to the right is a short wall, right? Because this is a rectangle, not a square. So we see that the left wall is long, the right wall is short, and not every corner has this property, right? There's only one corner, that's the opposite one right here, right? So if you turn 180, then you get the same thing, right? You get a long wall on the left and a short wall on the right, right? But notice that this corner and this corner have opposite properties, and that the long wall is going to be on the right and the short wall is going to be on the left for these two corners. Okay, so even though the walls are all gray, and even though there's no identifying markers, based purely off of the geometry of the room, you can start making some informed guesses or an improved strategy, such that each corner doesn't have a 25% chance of being the correct one where your food was previously located, but now you can narrow it down to these two corners, okay? So that's the idea here of how we can test geometrical knowledge in these chicks, okay? And this slide is just in words what I just explained to you, okay? So in order to solve this task, two basic forms of core geometric knowledge are required. First is the ability to discriminate metric properties of surfaces as surfaces, okay? In other words, that this is the short wall on the right, and this is the long wall on the left, okay? Also, in order to solve this task, another basic form of core geometric knowledge is required, and that's the ability to discriminate what we call sense in geometry, right? And this isn't long versus short. It's not metric properties. This is left versus right, okay, sense, okay? So with knowledge of left versus right, right? This chick has knowledge of left versus right and short versus long in order to help it improve its performance and narrow down the food location to one of these two corners. Okay. Interestingly enough, several species have solved this geometric task. Okay. In terms of chronology, Chang did some early work that was very important on rats. Okay, so Chang 1986 was on rats, but also this sort of study has been replicated with other animals, including human children, right? Hermer and Spelke did this in 94. This is bees are also able to solve this task. The authors are cited right here. Also, chicks and fish have been able to solve this task, okay, which is really cool. And I encourage you to look up these studies. It's nice to sort of see the finding, but also I encourage you to look at these studies so that way you can think about the methodology, right? Like, how would you go about designing this sort of study for fish, for example? That's a really interesting replication and extension right there. Okay, so think about it, how you would go about designing, replicating this study for fish. So the idea would be like, take the important parts of this study, keep as much of it as you can, right? But change something so that way it's appropriate for fish, okay? And that our hypothesis can be confirmed or disconfirmed with fish, okay? And the way that they did this with fish is instead of having a food reward, they had an exit, right? So like the fish would have to look for the exit, okay? All right. So these are some really awesome, fun studies, but I think that it's sufficient to make the point, okay? And I just sort of wanted to show you this slide before I forget, is that this is showing you sort of the performance, is that the performance for these corners, right? 40%, the chick 40% of the time checked this corner, 32% checked in this corner, right? And then notice in the other two corners, the percent that they checked there was much lower, okay? So 14.44% this corner, 13.34% in this corner, okay? That's just going to show you that the chicks significantly inspect those corners which demonstrate the properties of the wall, okay, based on their geometrical knowledge. Okay, cool. I just want you to see sort of the data from this result so you understand that this is a significant finding. Okay, I'm going to add one more sort of layer to this study. That's why I'm sort of going back and forth. We'll add one more layer to the study, and then we'll see that the results are still the same. Okay. All right, so what you might do now is ask yourself this question. What if, right, instead of putting newborn chicks, freshly hatched chicks into this environment, what if we raise them for a little bit in a different environment first, right? What if I put chicks in 3 different environments? This one, and this one. Will that affect their ability to perform this task? You might think, for example, that if knowledge is based on experience, then maybe if I put a chick in this, I raise the chick in this environment first, maybe they'll perform better on this task, right? Whereas if I put them and I raise them in this environment or this environment, they will not perform as well on a task. You could think that if a chick is raised in this environment, it's sort of developing experience of like edges, walls, sort of like square and rectangular features, things of that nature. Whereas on the other hand, if you raised a chick in this environment, a complete circle, there's no information about edges, right? It's actually very easy to sort of become completely disoriented in here because no matter which way you turn in a circular room, it looks the same, right? Imagine I drop you in this room, I spin you around and open your eyes, you have no idea which way you're facing in this room, okay? So that's sort of the intuition here. B is also very confusing, but notice that there is one axis. You could draw a line through the middle here and you can distinguish like one side from the other, okay? So this is the idea. We wanna try to raise chicks in a few different types of environments and see if this influences their ability to complete this task that we just discussed, okay? Again, to be very clear, if navigation abilities based on geometrical information is based on experience, one would expect that encoding of purely geometric information would be stronger in animals reared in the rectangular environment versus non-rectangular environments, right? And these are three conditions. A, this is a rectangular enclosure that provided metrically distinct surfaces connected at right angles and two principal axes of symmetry, okay? Rectangles, right? Two principal axes of symmetry. Condition B, geometric information was not available in the circular enclosure in which there was also an infinite number of principal axes. So this is actually C. So I'm sorry, I switched these two around. Condition C is the circular one, okay? And then condition B is the C-shaped enclosure where neither right angles nor differences in wall length were available, although the first principal axis was available to encode. What is meant by that, the first principal axis, is this axis right here, okay? So again, A is the rectangle, B is the C-shaped enclosure, and C is the circular enclosure, okay? Interestingly enough, results showed that chicks proved to be equally capable of learning and performing navigational tasks based on geometric information, irrespective of rearing in different environments, okay? So what was very interesting is that, as you can see here, reared within a rectangular shaped cage, and this is reared within a circular shaped cage, okay? Even though these are slightly different numbers, right? So in the rectangular shaped cage, we got 40% here. The circular shaped cage, we have 31.11% here. The important thing is that these corners are significantly different than these corners, okay? That's the important thing here, is that these corners, right? Those were the ones that the chick went to the most, statistically significant. That's a statistically significant result, whereas it went to these statistically much less, okay, to these corners, okay? What does that mean? It means that it doesn't matter, right? It's not significant whether you're raised here or here if you're a chick. As soon as I put you in this room right here, right, and I give you that task, you're going to use the properties of this room, right, to figure out what corner to go to, okay? And that's pretty amazing. And it gives us some very strong evidence that chicks are not drawing upon their experience of this environment to solve this task, but they're drawing upon their knowledge of geometry, okay? Again, this is just to show the result of chicks. It's another question whether humans, right, at a certain age, demonstrate this exact same result, Okay, I leave it to you as my scientists to go out and show me what's the case there. All right, so now we're at our last slide. So what do we talk about today? What do we talk about in this last article? Well, we covered the ideas, the main ideas of empiricism and nativism, right, as historically diametrically opposed positions, but we saw the argument by Spelke and others that perhaps we should think of this more productively as a continuum, okay, where some knowledge is more native or arises earlier in our developmental trajectory, whereas other forms of knowledge rely more on experience and occur much later in our developmental trajectory, okay. We also saw that we have evidence of core knowledge, like something like innate knowledge in non-human animals, as well as perhaps in humans as well. Okay, we know that we have certain reflexes as humans. We have a rooting reflex as humans. So if you're an infant and your caregiver strokes you on the cheek, right, you'll instinctively turn towards that side and start sucking. Okay, that's a reflex. Okay, you don't have to learn that, right? Cats have a righting reflex. If you drop a cat from a tree, it'll automatically turn right side up and land on its feet. That's a reflex. It doesn't have to learn through a history of falling how to do that. Okay, so that we know that we have some innate abilities or skills. Okay, and the things that come with us innately help us acquire later forms of knowledge or more complex forms of knowledge. Okay, well, we saw that in humans, object representation may not be purely innate, but it may arise very early in development. Like we saw that research suggests that it may arise at around 2 months, okay, like object permanence or at least intuitive physics, okay. We still have an open question of what else goes into the strongly innate versus the strongly based on experience forms of knowledge, okay. Things that we saw that seem to be innate in chicks and seem to be very early in humans, if not also innate in humans, were these forms of core knowledge: intuitive physics, biological motion, geometry, and faces, okay. We found that research suggests that extreme versions of empiricism, right, that the mind is a blank slate, cannot be correct as they fail to account for core knowledge. Research also suggests that extreme versions of nativism, right, that knowledge is innate, also cannot be correct, especially in the case of human children, since some forms of knowledge are not present at birth, but only after months of development. The important point, although it is convenient to think in simple dichotomous terms, empiricism versus nativism, and so on, results suggest that human knowledge and its development may require a more nuanced analysis that avoids overly simplistic dichotomies. Okay, so I hope that this lecture has provided you with some interesting information and also provided you with a challenge. What aspects of human cognition are really innate? Okay, we saw that human preference for human faces seems to be present even at birth. So maybe that's one of the things that we can put in the strongly innate category. Okay, we also see that other things take some time, experience, and development to know, right? So that's my challenge for you, is to, as we read through the articles, ask yourself, what kind of knowledge is this? And what's sort of the developmental timeline in which I can situate this form of knowledge, okay? Thank you for your attention today. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture. Have a great evening.